The year was 9 AD. In the still, ominous woods of Tettaburg, an unrelenting, rotten autumn had seized the ancient oaks and ashes, wrapping their centuries-old branches in a cold, deathly clutch. The sky above was a low, leaden canopy, pouring rain non-stop for the third day in a row, transforming the forest trails into a thick, slimy quagmire that squelched unpleasantly with each step. The air was heavy and dense, suffused with the mingled scents of damp leaves, decayed earth, and an undercurrent of growing dread. In this bleak wilderness, deep within the heart of a land fiercely resistant to conquest, the very core of untamed Germania, a colossal creature of iron and flesh was moving sluggishly, agonizingly slow, stretching across many kilometers. It was a great serpent in form, yet composed of human armor and sinew, a living, breathing mass of war-painted steel and battered bodies. This vast, relentless entity was the Roman army, an intimidating, hardened force, comprising 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with 6 auxiliary cohorts and 3 mounted alii. The whole formidable assembly amounted to about 20,000 warriors. This was the proud emblem of the empire's might, the embodiment of Augustus's imperial vision, a well-oiled machine designed to conquer and subjugate the world. Yet, at that very moment, this mighty instrument of expansion had come to a halt. The wheels of countless carts laden with equipment and supplies sank into the muddy mire. The hooves of the horses skidded on the slick, exposed roots, and the legionaries, cursing their luck and circumstance, struggled to keep their footing under their heavy armour and baggage. Their movement was laboured, almost desperate, slipping, stumbling, and falling in the mud. Behind the cacophonous sounds of rain, creaking wheels, and clattering weapons, an eerie feeling pervaded the forest. It seemed as though the very trees and shadows watched their every move, spying on them with millions of unseen eyes. From behind every trunk and over each hill, a hostile, invisible gaze tracked their progress, adding a chilling sense of foreboding. None of those marching soldiers, neither the inexperienced legionaries, seasoned centurions, nor even the commanding legate Publius Quinctilius Varus, yet realized the true peril that had already overtaken them. They were no longer simply marching through the wilderness. They had fallen into a trap. They headed not toward a winter camp, but straight into a deadly snare that threatened to snap shut at any moment. That bleak, damp day, the threads of fate wove themselves into a knot that would not only mean death for 20,000 men, but was destined to halt in its grip the unstoppable expansion of the greatest empire humanity had ever known. This deadly tangle of circumstances would carve a bloody line across the map of Europe, a scar that would remain unerasable even after 2,000 years. Before we delve into the blood-stained shadows of the Teutoburg Forest, it is crucial to understand what force had entered these savage lands, and why its defeat seemed an impossible feat. We must look upon this world through the eyes of a Roman coming into the early 1st century AD, for it was a world of grandeur and power. This epoch could be called the Roman Peace, or in Latin, Pax Romana. After a century of brutal civil wars that tore the Republic apart, when Caesar's legions clashed with those of Pompey, and Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, a new era of unprecedented peace, stability, and prosperity had dawned. At the heart of this peaceful landscape stood a man who had brought it into being, Gaius Octavius, the adopted son of the deified Julius Caesar. Awarded the honorary title by the Senate, he became known as Augustus, meaning the revered one. Augustus was a master of political disguise. He refused to call himself a king or dictator openly. Instead, He modestly styled himself as princeps, literature's term for first citizen, a figure presenting himself as merely the foremost among equals. Yet, behind this facade, all the real power resided entirely in his hands. He was the supreme commander of all Roman armies, controlling the treasury and appointing governors in the most critical provinces. The Roman society, exhausted by years of chaos, welcomed this new order with open arms. They eagerly embraced the stability Augustus provided, trusting his leadership to bring peace and order. The age they experienced was one where Rome's influence spread across vast territories, wounds from past civil strife healing, as the empire's boundless tents expanded, yet all under the watchful eye of the man who knew how to conceal his true authority behind a mask of republican traditions. This was an era of careful diplomacy, strategic subtlety, and iron control, reshaping the very fabric of the ancient world in a way that would leave an indelible mark for centuries to come. August brought them what they had long been craving most deeply: order. The boundaries of the empire, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Syria in the east, were now protected by the most advanced military machinery the world had ever seen: the disciplined ranks of the Roman legions. Piracy on the Mediterranean Sea, which they reclaimed and no longer called our sea or the Mare Nostrum, was eradicated, bringing stability to these waters. A magnificent network of paved roads was constructed, connecting even the most distant corners of the vast empire. These thoroughfares did not serve solely military purposes. Along them travelled not only legions, but also merchants, officials, and ideas, facilitating the growth of a unified economic and cultural space. Latin and Greek became the languages of international communication, fostering a shared sense of identity across diverse peoples. The cities, built according to the same blueprint, featured forums, theatres, aqueducts, and baths, symbols of a well-planned civilization. Rome carried to the subjected nations not only its martial might, but also its laws, architecture, and way of life. The foundation of this orderly world was an overarching ideology. Romans sincerely believed that their divine mission was to rule the world, a destiny bestowed upon them by the gods themselves. The poet Virgil, in his epic poem The Aeneid, put into the mouth of Jupiter a prophecy about the Romans, that he had granted them an empire without borders. Roman dominion was perceived not as tyranny, but as a benevolent force, an establishment of justice and civilization in places previously ruled by barbarism and perpetual tribal warfare. The primary instrument of this civilizing mission was the army. By the time of Augustus, the Roman military was no longer a militia of citizen soldiers, as it had been during the early Republic. Instead, it had become a professional, standing force, one of the most efficient and disciplined military organizations the world had ever seen. Its strength lay in the legion, a formidable military unit. A legion comprised roughly 5,000 heavy infantrymen, divided into 10 cohorts. Each cohort was subdivided into 6 centuries, each consisting of about 80 men. The century was commanded by a centurion, a seasoned, battle-hardened professional who was the backbone of the army, having risen from the ranks through experience and discipline. A legionary served 20 or 25 years. Over time, he transformed from a mere soldier into a versatile specialist, an engineer, a builder, a surveyor. The legions constructed roads, bridges, and fortresses, contributing significantly to the infrastructure of the empire. Roman discipline was legendary. Insubordination was punished with death. Yet, alongside strict rules, a system of rewards and honours existed. The soldiers received not only high wages, but also the promise of honourable retirement with land grants for their service. The arms and tactics of the Roman legions had been refined to perfection. Every legionary was equipped with a lorica segmentata, a segmented plate armour complemented by a large rectangular shield with a curved rim known as a scutum, and a distinctive helmet, the gallia. Their primary offensive weapons were the gladius, a short stabbing sword ideal for close combat in tightly packed formations, and two heavy throwing spears called pila. The pilum was a remarkable invention, a long, slender iron spear with a pointed tip designed to penetrate shields. When it struck, it would bend upon impact, rendering the enemy's shield unusable and preventing him from throwing it back. The famous formation of the legion, the testudo or tortoise, where soldiers interlocked their shields on all sides and above, created an almost impregnable armoured barrier. This formation could move under a hail of arrows and stones, transforming the legion into a moving fortress. Beyond the formidable realm of heavy infantry, the Roman army also included auxiliary troops, supporting units drawn from the non-citizen populations of the provinces. These auxiliaries consisted of cavalrymen, archers, slingers, and various other specialized fighters, of a nature that the native Romans themselves often lacked in adequate numbers or skills. Such a diverse and well-organized contingent contributed significantly to Rome's seemingly invincible military might. With this formidable force at its command, Rome appeared unstoppable. It shattered the mighty Hellenistic kingdoms thriving in the east, subdued the fierce Celtic tribes of Gaul, and defeated the Numidian cavalry on the African sands. For centuries, the Roman legions' disciplined cohesiveness and strategic prowess instilled a belief that no external power could stand against their relentless advance. Following Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul and the subsequent pacification of the Alpine tribes during the reign of Augustus, the next logical step for the expanding empire was to push into the lands beyond the Rhine. To the Romans, these territories, vast and populated by numerous, often disorganized tribes, were rich in resources and strategically valuable. Emperor Augustus set an ambitious goal to shift the border of the empire eastward from the Rhine to the Elbe River, known in Latin as Albis. This plan involved creating a new expansive province called Greater Germany, also known as Magna Germania. Such a move would serve to shorten the frontier, making it more defensible and securing the western provinces, especially Gaul, from potential threats coming from the east. Achieving this vision of territorial expansion was entrusted to Rome's most celebrated military commanders of the time. Prominent generals like Tiberius, who was also the future emperor, and Drusus, Augustus's stepson and trusted general. Over nearly 2 decades, starting from the year plus 12 BCE, these commanders led numerous arduous and bloody campaigns into the Germanic heartlands. Their efforts included establishing fortified outposts, engaging in decisive battles, and forging alliances with some tribes against others. By the year 0, the situation appeared to be nearing completion. Most of the territories lying between the Rhine and the Elbe had come under Roman control, and the conquest of Germany seemed within reach. The final major obstacle was the last great resistance posed by a powerful Germanic chieftain named Maroboduus and his confederation in the lands now known as the Czech Republic. In response, Tiberius assembled an army of no less than 12 legions, an unprecedented force the Romans had ever mustered for a single military operation. Yet, at that critical moment, a large-scale uprising erupted in the regions of Pannonia and Dalmatia on the Balkan Peninsula. The rebellion demanded immediate attention, forcing Tiberius to divert his legions southward to suppress the rebellion, delaying any further attempts at subduing Germany. Consequently, for the time being, the pacification of Germania was postponed. Meanwhile, a new governor, notorious in Roman history for the disastrous campaigns that would follow, was appointed to oversee the region that had been deemed nearly conquered. During these tumultuous times, while the Roman Empire, shining brightly with the splendour of civilization, built aqueducts and codified laws across the other side of the Rhine, the lands beyond the Roman reach revealed an entirely different world. This was Germany, a land shrouded in an atmosphere of fog and legend, its vast and ancient forests stretching endlessly, interwoven with marshy wetlands and swift-flowing rivers. To a Roman accustomed to the Mediterranean sun, the orderly geometry of urban life, and the familiar sights of empire, this wilderness seemed utterly alien, dark, ominous, and unfriendly. Nearly a century later, the Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus would describe these northern lands in his famous treatise on the origins and geography of the Germans. His vivid account painted a bleak picture. The country was either cloaked in dense, impenetrable woods or submerged beneath treacherous swamps. Tacitus noted that the landscape was more humid on the side facing Gaul and windier to the east, from Noricum and Pannonia. However, behind this seemingly forbidding facade lay a society markedly different from Rome, complex and autonomous, with values and modes of life that stood in stark contrast to Roman ideals. Despite their mysterious and seemingly wild exterior, the Germanic peoples cultivated their own unique culture, thriving in a land that, for outsiders, was often misunderstood and feared. Historically, ancient Germany was not a unified nation, but a land inhabited by countless tribes and clans, each with its own distinct identity and traditions. These tribes numbered in the dozens, if not hundreds, and although they often spoke related languages, they frequently found themselves at odds, engaged in fierce conflicts or mutual hostility. Among these peoples were the Cherusci, Hatti, Bructers, Marsians, Narmacans, and Frisians, names that, to the Roman ear, sounded like primitive, harsh murmurs. Yet behind each of these names lay a proud and fiercely independent people, proud of their heritage and their desire for freedom. Unlike the organized urban centers familiar to the Romans, the Germanic tribes did not develop cities as recognized in the Roman world. Instead, they resided mainly in small villages or isolated farms, comprising long wooden houses where humans and livestock often shared the same dwelling under one roof. Their most treasured possession was not the land itself, which they regarded as communal property belonging to their kin, but rather their livestock, which formed the cornerstone of their economy. Their livelihood primarily relied on primitive agriculture, hunting, and herding animals, reflecting a simple but resilient way of life. The political structure of these tribes was rooted in military democracy. The highest authority was vested in the tribal assembly, known as the Ting or Ding, where all free men capable of bearing arms gathered. It was in this assembly that tribal leaders, whom the Romans called kings or princes, were elected and with whom they made crucial decisions concerning warfare and peace. The Ting also served as a court where criminals were judged. A leader's power was not absolute. It depended greatly on his military success and the generosity he showed towards his warriors. Such rulers did not rule by divine right, nor was their authority strictly hereditary. Their influence lasted only as long as they maintained the tribe's support through victories and bounty. At a social level, the core unit was the warrior band, or družina, a close-knit group of fighters united around a charismatic and brave chieftain. Loyalty among members of the družina was unwavering, loyalty that Tacitus described as unparalleled, considering desertion or abandoning a fallen leader as disgraceful and shameful for a lifetime. The chieftain fought for victory, with his warriors fighting fiercely by his side, each one motivated by the promise of glory and honour. This system naturally bred constant intertribal conflicts, raids, and internal feuds, as war was not merely a political instrument, but an intrinsic aspect of their culture. For the Germanic warrior, war was the primary avenue to achieve fame and accumulate wealth. A Germanic warrior was a formidable sight in combat. Typically tall, with blonde or red hair, and often piercing blue eyes, he was brought up from childhood with discipline and training for battle. Their weaponry was relatively simple compared to the Roman arsenal. They rarely wore armour or helmets, opting instead for a large painted wooden shield that was brightly decorated. Their main weapon was a short spear called a phreamia, which could be used both for throwing and close quarters combat. Swords, considered symbols of nobility, were rare and signified high status among warriors. Before engaging in battle, they would invoke wrath and intimidation by shouting fierce war cries, often pressing their shields to their mouths to amplify the threatening sound, making it deeper and more frightening. Their warfare tactics relied on swift, overwhelming assaults, on the strength of that initial destructive strike. They often employed wedge formations, known as boar's head, designed to break through enemy ranks quickly and decisively. Germanic warriors were courageous almost to the point of recklessness, despising death and considering dying in battle as the most honourable fate a warrior could attain. Their religion was equally martial in character. Instead of worshipping gods within constructed temples, they revered their deities in sacred groves deep within untouched forests. Among their principal gods was Woden, the god of war, fury, wisdom, and the protector of chieftains and heroes. Others included Dona, a thunder god and warrior deity, Elitor, a thunderer and protector, and the divine Teu, or Tyr, symbolizing martial valor and righteousness. These deities reflected their values of strength, bravery, and resilience, shaping a spiritual worldview that exalted war and heroism as the highest ideals. In ancient society, priests held a position of immense significance and influence. They were responsible for conducting sacred rituals, which often included divination practices, such as observing the flight of birds or interpreting the neighing of the revered white horses. Considered divine messages, these spiritual leaders also performed sacrifices, sometimes of a human nature, especially after military victories, when they would offer these prisoners and captives as gifts to the deity Woden. For the German tribes, the forest was far more than a simple source of game or firewood. It was their homeland, a sanctuary, and a sacred temple rolled into one. They knew its every secret, its winding paths, mysterious marshes, and hidden clearings by heart. This intimate knowledge, combined with their innate martial spirit and fierce independence, rendered them a formidable and dangerous adversary on their native land. Over centuries, the Roman Empire, intoxicated by its vast power and arrogance, underestimated the true strength of the Germanic tribes. They perceived these tribes merely as primitive and uncivilized barbarians, a disorderly crowd that had to be either subdued or wiped out. The Romans endeavoured to impose their structures of governance, levying taxes, enforcing Roman laws through courts, constructing roads, and fortifying military outposts in the territories. Yet, in doing so, they fundamentally failed to grasp an essential truth. For the Germanic warriors, freedom was the highest and most sacred value. They could accept the authority of a chieftain stronger than themselves, but they would never submit to a distant empire that demanded tribute and obedience to alien laws. The Roman civilization, characterized by bureaucracy, taxation, and urban development, found little resonance among the tribes. It was alien, even hostile. Gradually, as the burden of Roman dominance grew unbearable and insults piled up in a growing sense of outrage, this wild, forest-bound world of the Germans was on the brink of explosive rebellion. All that was needed was a leader capable of uniting the fragmented tribes and channeling their collective fury against the common oppressor. Such a leader emerged in time. Meanwhile, as the Germanic tribes vented their frustrations beneath the oppressive rule of Rome, and as the Roman authorities celebrated what seemed to be the imminent completion of their conquest, a new governor arrived at the encampment near the Weser River. His name was Publius Quintilius Varus. Assigning this man to govern a still restive and volatile province was, in hindsight, one of the most disastrous political blunders in Roman history. Varus was the exact opposite of the seasoned, battle-hardened generals like Tiberius or Drusus, who had previously led campaigns in Germany. He was not a soldier, but an administrator, a lawyer rather than a conqueror. Coming from an ancient but impoverished patrician family, Var's career had been built not on battlefield achievements, but on close ties to Emperor Augustus and his marriage to Claudia Pulchra, the granddaughter of the emperor himself. As a member of the Roman aristocracy's elite, he was accustomed to luxury, comfort, and unquestioning obedience. Prior to his appointment in Germany, he served as governor of Africa and, more importantly, of Syria, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated provinces in the empire. In Syria, Var demonstrated himself as a strict and efficient administrator. When the Jewish king Herod the Great had died, leading to a revolt in Judea, Var suppressed it with typical Roman ruthlessness, ordering the crucifixion of 2,000 captured rebels. Such actions earned him a reputation as a man unwilling to tolerate compromise. Yet, governing Syria's ancient cities, with their thriving economies and historically compliant populations, was one enterprise. Managing the wild, forested Germania, inhabited by proud, fiercely independent tribes, was a completely different challenge altogether. The distinction between these two figures is profound and often misunderstood. Varius arrived in Germania not as a military leader commanding troops against enemies, but rather as a provincial governor in a land already subdued and integrated into the Roman Empire. Historian Velleius Paterculus, who served under Tiberius in Germania and was well acquainted with the regional situation firsthand, left a profoundly critical account of Varius. He described him as a man of gentle disposition and calm temperament, more accustomed to leisurely life in a camp than to the rigours of military command. Upon entering Germania, Varius apparently believed that the Germanic tribes were primitive beings, people whose only semblance of humanity lay in their language and limbs, and that those tribes resistant to military suppression could be subdued through legal and bureaucratic means. Soon, Varius began actively implementing Roman customs and administrative practices deep within Germania. Riding across the land with his retinue as if he were on a peaceful journey through Italy rather than a foreign province, he dispensed judicial blows, settled disputes between tribes using Roman civil law, and imposed taxes and levies. His conviction was that he was bringing light and civilization to the barbarians, but for the Germanic tribes, his efforts felt more like an indignity and an insult. Long accustomed to resolving their conflicts on the open air of the Tinge or through single combat, they now found their disputes being judged by an outsider through interpreters, far removed from their customary ways. The tribes, proud and fiercely independent, were compelled to pay taxes in coin, currencies they hardly possessed, and the complex and often confusing Roman laws seemed to them unjust and opaque. Varius, in his arrogance and laziness, never made an effort to understand the Germanic mindset. He scorned their customs and blindly trusted certain members of the German aristocracy who had switched allegiance to Rome, believing them to be allies in the Romanization process. His circle was filled with flatterers and sycophants who assured him that the process of Roman cultural dominance was advancing rapidly and that the tribes willingly embraced Roman authority. For a time, Varius ignored the growing signs of unrest, dismissing warnings and warning signs as mere exaggerations. He preferred to cling to his illusions, trusting his perceptions more than the reality unfolding around him. Among his closest advisors and most trusted friends was a young, charismatic, and clever chieftain of the Hyrtusk tribe. This man had received Roman citizenship and the equestrian rank, spoke Latin fluently, and knew all the strengths and weaknesses of the Roman military, having served in its ranks himself. He looked Varius directly in the eyes, called him a friend, and was often invited to dine with him daily. Yet, this same person was silently preparing a sinister plan, one that could spell doom for Varius and his legions, and beneath his genial facade lay a cold calculation for treacherous betrayal. While Varius lulled himself into believing that the Romanization of Germania was imminent and irreversible, a dangerous conspiracy quietly grew within his close circle, like a serpent coiled in the shadows of his confidence. At the heart of this insidious plot was a figure who would become one of the most tragic and paradoxical personalities in the history of Germanic-Roman relations. His name was most likely Germanic or Hermann in the Germanic tongue, but history remembers him under his Latinized name, Arminius. He was the son of a powerful chieftain of the Hyrtusk tribe, Segama, whose people dwelled along the banks of the Weser River, in the very core of those territories that the Romans sought to transform into a province. Arminius was born approximately in the 17th or 18th year before Christ, at a pivotal moment when the legions under Drusus and Tiberius launched their first campaigns beyond the Rhine. His childhood and youth were overshadowed by the continuous presence of war and Roman expansion. As was customary at the time, to ensure the loyalty of the tribal aristocracy, the Romans often took hostages, children of the chieftains, exposing them to Roman customs and education, weaving a complex web of loyalty and betrayal, which would play a crucial role in the unfolding events. Young Arminius, along with his brother Flavius, was sent to Rome, but this journey was by no means a form of punishment or exile. Rather, it was a privilege that offered him an exceptional opportunity for education and personal growth. During his years in the imperial city, he was raised amidst the grandeur of Roman civilization, immersing himself in its culture, laws, and military traditions. He mastered Latin with remarkable fluency, studied the art of warfare in depth, and learned the fundamentals of Roman law and government. Through this experience, he saw firsthand the magnificence of Rome, the formidable power that upheld its empire, as well as the richness of its cultural achievements and societal institutions. Being granted Roman citizenship was considered a tremendous honor for a provincial, conferring upon him all the privileges and rights that came with it. Additionally, he was inducted into the equestrian order, the second most prestigious social class after the senatorial elite. This recognition transformed Arminius from a mere auxiliary fighter into a genuine part of the Roman world. As he grew older, it was only natural that he would follow the path laid out by his elevated status and serve in the Roman military. He commanded a unit of German auxiliary cavalry and fought shoulder to shoulder with legionaries, gaining invaluable combat experience. In the years of about the 6th and 8th after the birth of Christ, he participated in quelling the infamous Illyrian uprising on the Balkan Peninsula, which was conducted under the overarching command of Emperor Tiberius. This campaign provided him with a rare opportunity to observe the Roman army in action during one of its most intense and grueling conflicts. He learned to recognize the army's strengths, its discipline, its meticulous organization, and its impressive engineering skills. But he also became painfully aware of its weaknesses, its sluggishness when navigating rugged terrain, its heavy reliance on supply wagons, and its vulnerability during marches, especially across unfamiliar or difficult landscapes. Gradually, he came to understand how Roman commanders thought and planned, how they constructed their strategies and tactics, understanding the machine of conquest from within, down to its smallest component. What thoughts and feelings stirred within this young man's soul remain a profound mystery. Was he originally a secret patriot, patiently biding his time, pretending allegiance to Rome while secretly waiting for the moment to strike? Or was he genuinely supportive of the Roman Empire, only to become disillusioned as he saw how his people were oppressed and plundered? The Roman historian Valerius Paterculus, who knew Arminius personally, wrote that he was brave in battle, possessed a sharp and lively mind, surpassing that of a barbarian, and that a fiery spirit burned brightly in his eyes and face. Most likely, he was torn between two worlds. On one side, he was a Roman citizen and officer, having tasted the advantages that civilization and order could offer, seeing the empire's might firsthand. On the other hand, he was the son of Sigimer, prince of the Cherusci, and thus held a deep ancestral connection to his native Germanic roots. He witnessed how his kin lost their freedom, how their ancient customs were trampled upon by arrogant Roman governors, like the infamous Varus, who represented the imperial arrogance that oppressed and marginalized his people. After returning to Germania from the Illyrian campaign, Arminius quickly rose to command auxiliary German units under the standard of Varus's army. His talents and loyalty earned him the confidence of the Roman legate overseeing the campaign, and he became a trusted confidant and valuable advisor. Young, intelligent, charismatic, and fluent in Latin, he understood Roman mentality and leadership well, and his presence was a living testament to the success of the Roman policy of civilizing and Romanizing local tribes. Recognizing his potential, Varus appointed him as his closest advisor, and they often dined and strategized together, with Varus placing great trust in his insight and judgment. Meanwhile, in secret, Arminius was weaving a complex network of alliances. He held clandestine meetings with leaders of other tribes, such as the Hattians, the Bructers, and the Marsi, urging them to forget old rivalries and unite against the common Roman foe. This was an extraordinarily delicate and difficult task, requiring exceptional diplomacy, patience, and foresight. He sought to forge a coalition capable of resisting the might of Rome, even as he outwardly maintained loyalty to the Roman authorities. With each passing day, his plans grew more intricate, slowly building towards a larger, more comprehensive resistance, an answer to the empire's relentless expansion that would ultimately change the fate of Germania and the Roman provinces alike. Germanic chieftains were proud and fiercely independent, unaccustomed to obedience or subjugation under any ruler. However, Armenia managed to persuade them otherwise, employing all his eloquence and authority as a Roman officer, combined with a comprehensive knowledge of Roman plans. He argued convincingly that if they did not act together to strike now, it would soon be too late, that Rome would conquer them one by one if they hesitated. Not all of the Germanic leaders supported his call for unity, and among dissenters was his own father-in-law, the esteemed chieftain Segest. Segest was a firm supporter of a strategic alliance with Rome. He viewed this as the only viable path to lasting peace and prosperity for their tribes. His hatred for Armenia was intense, compounded further by personal grievance. Armenia had kidnapped his daughter, Tusnelda, and married her against his wishes. Several times, Segest tried to warn Var of the impending danger, revealing details of the conspiracy, naming the traitorous leaders, and begging him to arrest Armenia and his accomplices. But Var, blinded by his arrogance and his friendship with Armenia, dismissed these warnings as mere slander, a petty feud between Germanic chiefs that should be ignored. He brushed aside the pleas that could have saved his life and his legions from catastrophe. The trap was set, and all that remained was to lure the beast into its snare. Autumn had arrived in the year of our Lord 409. The Roman army, commanded by Quintilius Varus, had spent the summer camped along the Visa River, deep within Germania, preparing to retreat to their winter quarters fortified along the Rhine. This seasonal movement was a routine event, repeated year after year. The army was no ordinary fighting force. It was a mobile city, a vast military complex composed of 3 legions, totaling around 15,000 men, accompanied by auxiliary troops numbering approximately 5,000. Along with the soldiers, a considerable quantity of civilian personnel moved with the expedition: traders, marketplace vendors, craftsmen, and the families of both soldiers and officers, including their wives and children. All of this transformed the army into a sprawling, unwieldy column, stretching roughly 15 to 20 kilometers in length. It was during this moment that Armenia enacted his diabolical plan. A messenger arrived with urgent news. A distant tribe, purportedly, had risen in rebellion. The insurrection was minor and localized, occurring away from the well-worn and familiar Roman route leading to the Rhine. Armenia, standing nearby and full of fervour, seized the moment to persuade Var that this uprising demanded immediate suppression to prevent similar rebellions elsewhere. He argued passionately that crushing this small revolt would serve as a clear demonstration of Roman power, and that the authorities could also collect additional taxes before the onset of winter. Armenia proposed to Var that they march towards the uprising along a short yet poorly known route through the Teutoburg Forest, an unexplored trail that would bypass the established Roman defences. Armenia's loyal Germanic auxiliaries would serve as guides, ensuring the group's safe passage. This decision was pivotal. Instead of following the familiar, relatively safe road along which Roman fortifications had already been established, Var chose to divert onto an uncharted, uncertain trail. He placed complete trust in his friend's assurances. On the eve of departure, a farewell feast was held. During this gathering, for the last time, Var's father-in-law, Segest, also attempted to influence the course of events. He warned that Armenia's plan was treacherous and urged caution, recognizing the danger of veering off the known path. Yet, Var, blinded by his confidence in Armenia and underestimating the risks, dismissed the warnings as mere conspiracy, a personal grudge from Segest rather than genuine concern. As the soldiers and civilians prepared to set out the following morning, the stage was set for what would become one of the most disastrous episodes in Roman Germanic history. A trap carefully crafted beneath the guise of a minor rebellion, designed to catch the unwary and unleash chaos on the Roman legions in the depths of the Germanic forest. In a tense and dramatic turn of events, he openly accused Arminius of treachery and demanded that Var, acting as the military commander, arrest him in addition to the other rebel leaders, all while they were all seated together at the same table. However, Var, irritated and exasperated by these savage accusations and chaotic outbursts, ignored his words completely. His trust lay with Arminius, whom he believed to be loyal, rather than with his father-in-law, whose claims he dismissed as unfounded. As dawn approached the next day, Arminius and the other conspirators, claiming that they needed to gather their troops to support the Romans, quietly left the encampment under the pretense of assembling reinforcements. In reality, they moved not to rally allies, but to take up prearranged positions for an ambush. Var was left alone, abandoned among the silent trees. Acting on a reckless impulse, he decided to lead his army straight into the trap, heading into the nearby woods. The forest was unlike the well-maintained, manageable woods of Italy that Roman soldiers were accustomed to. Instead, they found themselves in untamed, primordial wilderness, an ancient, savage thicket. Towering trees stood so densely packed that sunlight struggled to pierce through their high canopies, casting everything into shadow. Underfoot, the ground was muddy and treacherous, a morass of wetness that made every step uncertain. Obstacles like fallen logs, tangled brush, and natural artificial barriers, such as ravines, impeded their progress, stretching their column into an even longer, more vulnerable line. The soldiers constantly had to chop through trees, construct makeshift bridges and rafts to haul their wagons, and struggle to maintain pace. Suddenly, the relentless rain intensified, turning the entire landscape into a slick, muddy quagmire. The cold, relentless downpour soaked leather shields, making them heavy and unwieldy, and drenched cloaks and tunics, causing shivering among the troops. The once useful linen bows and other equipment became useless as they soaked through, losing their effectiveness. Morale sank as soldiers cursed their fate, cursing Germany, the invasion, and the rain that had led them into this wilderness. Amidst this chaos and exhaustion, a thunderous and wild cry erupted from deep within the forest, shattering the oppressive silence. It was Baratus, a ferocious, deafening roar that seemed to come from the very earth itself. From all directions, over hills, behind trees, from the shadows of the woods, a horde of German warriors erupted onto the exhausted Roman column. The attack was not a traditional, frontal assault executed for a clean, organized engagement. Instead, it was a savage, hit-and-run assault. The Germans launched short, lightning-fast strikes aimed at the most vulnerable parts of the Roman formation, then swiftly disappeared into the dense forest, which served as both their home and an ally. They hurled javelins, framis, from vantage points above, striking Roman soldiers who lacked the opportunity to form their defensive testudos, a traditional turtle formation, due to the chaos. They also launched attacks on the baggage train, killing the drivers, capturing supplies, and adding to the disorder. The Romans found themselves in a difficult, almost desperate tactical predicament. Their main advantages, strict discipline and well-organized formations, became virtually useless amidst the chaotic, forested slaughter. Each legionary was forced to fight individually, defending himself against enemies appearing from nowhere, striking before vanishing into the woods once more. Realizing the depth of betrayal, Var finally understood that his forces had been abandoned to this trap. In a desperate attempt to organize some form of resistance, he ordered the remaining baggage and supplies to be ignited, hoping to hasten their escape. He then directed his troops toward a clearing, an open space where they could hopefully set up a defensive line and reorganize the legions. Despite extremely heavy losses, the Romans managed to fight their way through the relentless waves of attack, rallying together by evening. Demonstrating their renowned engineering skills, they hastily constructed a fortified camp suitable for overnight stay, a fragile refuge amid the chaos. The first day of fighting was not yet over, but the battle was only just beginning. Night fell over the hastily built shelter, transforming the encampment into a living nightmare. The relentless rain persisted without pause, soaking everything and everyone. Wounded soldiers groaned in pain amid the darkness, their bodies too exhausted to move. From the surrounding forest, victorious German war cries echoed through the gloom, a chilling reminder of their savage success. Even more terrifying were the screams of those unfortunate captives who had fallen into enemy hands, some of whom were now being brought forward as sacrificial offerings to pagan gods, their suffering adding a horrifying dimension to this already brutal ordeal. On the dawn of the second day, it became painfully evident that their situation was truly desperate. The notion of continuing their march along the wooded trail became entirely unthinkable given the mounting dangers. Commander Var made the crucial decision to steer their battered forces westward, aiming for the nearest Roman fortification, Alazon, a stronghold he estimated was still a few days' journey away. In silence and urgency, they abandoned their makeshift camp, leaving behind the wounded to fend for themselves, and set fire to the remaining carts and supplies to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. To streamline their movements and increase their chances of survival, the fighters formed into a more compact combat formation before setting out once again into the wild. However, Arminius, the Roman commander, had anticipated such a maneuver. His cunning foresight prevented their escape, as he was well aware of their intentions. Increasingly numerous, the Germanic tribes, who kept joining their ranks upon hearing of earlier victories, no longer merely conducted sporadic raids. Instead, they now stalked the Roman army like predatory hunters tracking a wounded prey. They cunningly forced the legions into the most intractable, marshy terrains, where pursuit became perilous and opportunities for ambush abundant. These Germanic warriors, lighter and more agile, navigated the familiar, treacherous landscape with ease, slipping through the treacherous mud and reeds. In stark contrast, the heavily armed Roman legionaries found themselves bogged down in the swamp, their progress slow and exhausting, their limbs sinking into the sticky mire. The Roman cavalry proved nearly useless in such treacherous conditions, unable to effectively maneuver or support the ground forces. Despite suffering severe casualties, losses that seemed almost insurmountable, they refused to halt their relentless advance. Driven by their indomitable resolve, the battered soldiers fought fiercely, defending themselves with a desperate, almost frantic determination, even as hope waned. By the end of the second day, they managed to establish a new camp. However, it was even more pathetic and fragile than the previous one. Exhausted and demoralized, their strength ebbing away, they faced mission impossible, their morale shattered beyond repair. It was amidst this dire situation, on the third day, that Arminius decided to launch what he believed would be the decisive strike. He lured the remnants of the Roman army into a narrow defile, a natural corridor squeezed between a vast marsh on one side and a lush, forested hillock on the other. On this hillock, the Romans faced a brutal surprise. Recent archaeological excavations in the 20th and 21st centuries in the Calcrete region of Lower Saxony have shed remarkable light on the unfolding events of that last fateful day. Researchers discovered that the Germanic tribes had constructed a long earthen rampart stretching roughly 600 meters, reinforced with a wooden palisade. Hidden within the surrounding woods, this rampart ran parallel to the road and was perfectly positioned for accurate, targeted fire upon the marching Roman column below. This was not a mere ambush. This was a meticulously planned engineering operation, a masterstroke of military cunning, where Arminius employed Roman principles of field fortification to turn traps against their architects. As the exhausted remnants of 3 legions entered this deadly snare, terror erupted. From the concealed rampart, a barrage of spearheads rained down upon them. The Germanic tribes, shielded behind the defensive earthwork, were virtually invulnerable to defensive fire. a fact that made the Roman soldiers on the narrow strip of land vulnerable targets, effective and exposed. Their disciplined formation disintegrated under the barrage. Chaos seized the ranks. Panic spread like wildfire. Legionaries, discarding their useless shields and javelins, desperately sought to assault the rampart, but their attacks were drowned in blood and chaos. The authoritative command structure crumbled completely, leaving the soldiers without guidance or coordination. Faced with inevitable defeat, Quintilius Var, the Roman commander, chose a tragic end. Not willing to be captured and subject to shame or humiliation, he hurled himself onto his sword, ending his life. Several senior officers followed his grim example, collapsing under the weight of despair and honour. But for the ordinary legionary, this was merely the end of everything, an abrupt transition from battle to slaughter. With no command and surrounded on all sides, their fate was sealed. What followed was not a conventional fight, but a brutal massacre. The Germanic tribes leapt over the rampart, ruthlessly slaughtering the wounded, the defenceless, and anyone still resisting. The scene that unfolded was one of horror and ruthlessness, an unrelenting slaughter that marked the tragic culmination of an ill-fated campaign. Few escaped the horrors of that calamity, and among those brave enough to wander through the dense forests seeking safety, only a handful managed to reach the banks of the Rhine. The vast majority met their end right there, slaughtered on the spot, victims of the brutal assault. The captured prisoners faced a fate that was equally grim and terrifying. The high-ranking officers and centurions, regarded as the leaders and symbols of Roman strength, were taken to sacred groves, where they were sacrificed in dark rituals. They were hung on trees, their throats slit above cauldrons to collect their vital blood, which was then used in rites considered sacred. Later, their severed heads were displayed on spears and stakes in the rural settlements of the German tribes, serving as gruesome warnings to all who dared to oppose. Ordinary legionaries, those lower in rank, either faced imminent death or were mercilessly turned into slaves, forced to serve the very tribes that had so ruthlessly annihilated their comrades. Yet, for the Germanic tribes, the most coveted trophies of conquest were not simply the prisoners or plundered weapons. Their true prizes were the sacred standards of the 3 Roman legions, magnificent eagles known as Aquilus, which embodied the very soul and honour of each legion. These eagles were revered as divine symbols of Roman military prowess and prestige. To lose an eagle was regarded as the greatest dishonour imaginable, a stain that tarnished the reputation of an entire legion forever. The capture of all 3 at once was nothing less than a national catastrophe for Rome, a humiliating disaster that symbolised complete and unequivocal defeat. Consequently, the 17th, 18th and 19th legions, along with their numerals, were erased entirely from the historical records of the Roman military, never again to bear those identifying numbers. The Teutoburg Forest, where this massacre took place, transformed into a cursed place in the eyes of Rome, becoming a colossal mass grave and a haunting symbol of that most devastating defeat. News of this catastrophe spread slowly, reaching Rome with difficulty. The first to bring reports were the few survivors, those battered, dismembered, and maddened, who managed to cross the Rhine and escape. At first, their accounts seemed like the ramblings of lunatics, impossible stories that strained credulity. They spoke of 3 legions, completely annihilated, along with their commanding generals, officers, and supplies. A catastrophe of unprecedented scale since the last defeat inflicted by the Cherusci. As more confirmations of the tragedy arrived, the entire Roman world was gripped by shock and then by frantic panic. According to the historian Suetonius, the Emperor Augustus, already over 70 years old, was utterly devastated by the news. He was the founder of the empire, the architect of Roman peace, and now, in his later years, he suffered a devastating blow to his legacy. Suetonius records that Augustus refused to cut his hair or shave for several months as a sign of mourning. He would often beat his forehead against doorframes, crying out the famous phrase of Quintilius Varus, "Give me back my legions." That desperate cry of the aging emperor would become an enduring symbol of the tragic loss that struck Rome so deeply. Augustus was not a man prone to sentimentalism. His grief wasn't solely for the 20,000 soldiers lost in battle. He understood the strategic consequences better than anyone. The greatest fear was a looming invasion into Gaul. The Rhine frontier, which had been a formidable barrier, now lay virtually unprotected. If the well-rested and victorious Arminius had managed to unite the disparate Germanic tribes and lead them across the river, he could have ignited a rebellion that spread into the recently subdued territories of Gaul itself. Such an uprising could have spiraled into chaos, with unpredictable and far-reaching consequences for the empire's northern frontier. In response to this dire threat, Emperor Augustus took extraordinary measures. The city of Rome entered a state of mobilization, with armies being summoned and military preparations accelerated to an unprecedented level. Since voluntary recruitment was proving to be insufficient, service in the Germanic campaigns had become deeply unpopular, especially after such a severe defeat. Authorities resorted to conscription by force. Every 10th man who attempted to evade service was executed as a warning to others. Veteran soldiers, seasoned from previous campaigns, were called back into service to bolster the remaining legions. The atmosphere in the capital grew tense, taut with wartime anxiety. The emperor, distrustful of his personal guard of Germanic bodyguards after the loss, disbanded his own retinue, refusing to trust any of them any longer. Command of the Rhine's forces was entrusted to the most experienced Roman general available, Tiberius, the emperor's stepson and a seasoned military leader. The entire empire was mobilized for a war that promised to be one of its greatest crises, with the fate of Rome hanging in the balance. Upon his arrival at the Rhine, he swiftly imposed order, wielding authority with a firm hand to restore discipline among the troops and prepare the remaining legions for potential defence. Thankfully for Rome, his semi-Trivogni Upicenia remained unrealised. Armenia either failed or did not deem it necessary to mount an invasion. The coalition, assembled solely for the purpose of driving the Romans out, quickly disintegrated after the initial victory. Tribal rivalries and envy of Armenia's triumphs resurfaced, fracturing what unity had been achieved. The Germanic tribes, though formidable warriors, proved to be inept at nation building. They lacked the capacity to forge a strong, unified state, capable of challenging Rome on its own soil. Their efforts were limited to demolishing the remaining Roman fortifications east of the Rhine, while only the garrison of the fortress Alesia, commanded by the Praetorian prefect Lucius Sidicius, managed to withstand the siege. Against all odds, this fortress held out, and after fierce combat, the defenders broke through the encirclement and retreated toward the Rhine. The catastrophe in the Teutoburg Forest carried consequences far beyond the battlefield, impacting Rome psychologically and politically as well. It shattered the myth of invincible legions, revealing that certain peoples were either impossible or exceedingly difficult to assimilate into Roman rule. The seemingly inevitable conquest of Germany, which had once seemed within reach, transformed into a humiliating defeat. In his final years, Emperor Augustus, in drafting his political will, known as the Deeds of Divine Augustus, advised future rulers against further territorial expansion, insisting that the empire had already reached its natural borders. The Rhine, once intended to serve as the empire's internal boundary, became a permanent, fortified, and bleeding frontier that defined the limit of Roman reach. The battle deep in the Teutoburg Forest did not merely result in the loss of 3 legions, it shattered the dream of a great united Germania. Rome was forced to shift from offensive campaigns to a defensive posture. An empire that believed it could expand forever suddenly encountered an invisible wall, erected not of bricks or stone, but of the wrath and resilience of the forest tribes, and was compelled to retreat. Rome, with its centuries-old claim to boundless dominion, could not ignore the stark reality of this barrier. Their defeat was a wound too painful to ignore, an insult impossible to accept, especially knowing that the loss of 3 eagle standards was a stain on Roman honour that could not be tolerated. In response, the desire for vengeance ignited across the entire empire, becoming an issue of national pride. The quest to redress this shame was taken up by a young, exceptionally talented, and incredibly popular military leader, Germanius, a name that carried weight and significance. His name was no accident. He was the son of the very chieftain who had first initiated the Roman conquest of Germania, earning the honorary title Germanicus for his early successes. Now it was his destiny to complete his father's mission and avenge the fallen standards, especially those lost in the tragic defeat at Teutoburg Forest. In the year 4 of the Common Era, the aging Emperor Augustus passed away. Power then shifted to Tiberius, who inherited the imperial mantle. That same year, Germanicus, commanding 8 legions along the Rhine, began his punitive campaigns. Unlike typical conquest expeditions, these were characterized by their vengeance-driven nature, designed not merely to conquer, but to punish and humiliate. Germanicus aimed to demonstrate to the German tribes that Rome had the capability and will to strike anywhere, at any time, unleashing all the fury of the empire upon them. His first target was the Marcomanni tribe. Under the cover of night, his legions launched a swift, meticulously planned march, encircling a village where the Marcomanni celebrated one of their traditional festivals. The result was a brutal slaughter. Roman forces showed no mercy to women, children, or elderly, anyone caught in their path. Tacitus, in his sober recounting, describes how, within a radius of 50 miles around the scene of the attack, the land was ravaged by fire and sword, leaving destruction in their wake. This campaign, part of Germany's harsh and unrelenting military response, highlighted that the Roman military's vengeance was as thorough as it was ruthless, aimed at sending a stark message that Rome's reach extended into the depths of their territories, and that defiance would be met with devastating force. The act of intimidation that Germany experienced sent shockwaves through the entire nation. This brutal display of force reignited the tribe's resolve to unify once more around Armenia, a vital symbolic centre of their resistance. In the following year, which marked the 15th since that pivotal event, the Germanic tribes mounted an even larger and more ambitious military campaign. One of their primary objectives was to locate the precise site where Varus's legions had met their doom, and to honour the fallen by bringing their remains together in a sacred land. Consequently, the Roman legions advanced into the dense and foreboding Teutoburg Forest, an area infamous for its treacherous terrain and dark legends. The sight that greeted them was almost beyond belief, even for battle-hardened veterans accustomed to the horrors of warfare. Tacitus, relying on eyewitness accounts, left us a chilling description of the scene. Amidst a cleared field, stark white bones lay scattered, some swept into piles while others were simply abandoned upon the ground. Nearby, remains of weapons and horse skeletons were strewn across the landscape, and on the trunks of several trees, human skulls were affixed as grim trophies. In the adjacent groves, barbarian altars stood silent testimony to their pagan rites, a place where the tribes had sacrificed 3 Roman officers, a tribunus and a centurions, whose fates and identities remained largely unknown to the grieving soldiers. These men, overwhelmed with sorrow and rage, took on the sombre task, digging graves to bury the bones of their comrades, though they did not always know exactly whose remains they laid to rest. Every corpse seemed to represent a friend, a kin, each silent grave fueling a fierce thirst for revenge within the hearts of the legionaries. This dark and sombre ritual deepened their resolve, transforming grief into a burning desire for retribution. In the very same year, Germania achieved a personal triumph when it captured Teutoburg, the pregnant wife of Arminius, a man whom they considered a hero and leader. Her father, Augustus, betrayed his daughter by handing her over to the Germans, an act that brought profound tragedy into Arminius's life. According to Tacitus, the loss drove Arminius into a furious grief. He became a man possessed, roaming across Germany in fervent, desperate calls for a sacred war against the Romans. The injustice of this act, the kidnapping of his wife and the unborn child, ignited a rage so intense that it seemed to consume him entirely. Teutoburg was eventually taken to Rome, where she was paraded in a triumphant procession honouring Germania's military leader, her plight becoming a stark symbol of the brutal realities of conquest. While in captivity, she gave birth to a son named Tumellus. The boy grew up in obscurity, perhaps following the path of a gladiator, and ultimately met his fate fighting on the arena, succumbing to the violent spectacle of Roman entertainment. The circumstances surrounding Arminius's family remained deeply tragic throughout these tumultuous times. The climax of Germania's military campaigns occurred in what was the year 16, a period marked by 2 decisive battles. The first was fought on the expansive plains near Idisvisum, along the banks of the Weser River. Arminius, having amassed a formidable army, made the fateful decision to confront the Romans in open battle, a choice that proved disastrous. On the vast, exposed terrain, the disciplined Roman legions proved to be irresistible, crushing the Germanic forces with ruthless efficiency. The fierce and bloody clash resulted in a humiliating defeat for Germania. The German tribes suffered a significant and humiliating defeat, their lines broken and morale shattered. Arminius himself sustained injuries but managed to escape, cleverly disguising his face with blood to avoid recognition amidst the chaos. Not long after, there was another devastating encounter at a place called the Anrawal Wall, an earthwork fortification where Germania suffered yet another heavy defeat. Despite these setbacks, Berlin's military leader, Germanicus, managed to secure a convincing victory. His forces successfully reclaimed 2 of the 3 Golden Eagles, military standards lost in earlier battles, and the 3rd eagle would be recovered later, in the year 41. It seemed as if justice had been done, that the Germans had avenged Varus's massacre, and that the path to conquering Germania was once again open. Driven by this victorious momentum, Germanicus eagerly planned future campaigns, aiming to crush Arminius and his tribes once and for all in the following year. However, these ambitions were suddenly interrupted by an unexpected order from Rome. Emperor Tiberius, an experienced military leader himself and well acquainted with Germany's dangerous landscape, summoned Germanicus back to the imperial capital. Officially, the reason was to celebrate his well-earned triumph, a formal recognition of military success. Yet, behind this facade lay deeper political motives. Tiberius perhaps envying his nephew's growing popularity, or perhaps recognizing the enormous resources and lives that would be required to fully subjugate Germany, made a cold, pragmatic decision. He understood that the complete conquest of this vast, forested frontier would demand overwhelming sacrifices, both in terms of manpower and wealth, with little to no lasting economic gain from such a remote and impoverished land. Germanicus's victories, though brilliant in their execution, had not provided a decisive solution to the core problem, the formidable difficulty of subduing Germania once and for all. The guerrilla warfare that raged through the endless, dense forests could have gone on forever, seemingly unending and unstoppable. Yet, Tiberius believed that such a prolonged struggle was no longer worth the effort, and decided to put an end to it. He chose instead to revert to the policies of Augustus, establishing the Rhine as a clear natural boundary and leaving the Germanic tribes to their own devices, allowing them to continue their internecine conflicts without external interference. The victorious Germanicus returned triumphant to Rome, where he was celebrated for his achievements, only to be later dispatched to the east. There, in the unfolding, mysterious circumstances of his death, possibly due to poisoning, his fate remained shrouded in suspicion. As for Armenia, its story was also steeped in tragedy. After the retreat of Roman forces, the local ruler endeavoured to unify the disparate Germanic tribes under his authority and to crown himself their king. However, the fiercely independent Germanic peoples, tolerant of his leadership in times of external threat, but resistant to any form of submission in peace, refused to accept his rule. This resistance plunged him into conflict with the Marcomannic ruler, Maribod, and eventually led to his downfall. His own tribesmen, harbouring suspicion and resentment, conspired against him, accusing him of aspiring to tyranny. In the year of our Lord 21, when he was only 37, the liberator of Germany was betrayed and murdered by his kin. The Roman historian Tacitus, though an enemy of the Germanic tribes, wrote an epitaph that conveyed profound respect and admiration for him. He described him as indubitably the liberator of Germania, someone who dared to challenge the might of Rome, not in its infancy, as many other rulers had, but during its period of greatest power. Tacitus acknowledged that while he was not consistently successful in battle, the Germanic leader remained undefeated in war, a figure who continues to be celebrated in barbarian songs and oral traditions. The confrontation in the Teutoburg Forest was not the largest or bloodiest in Roman history, yet it was arguably the most consequential in its long-term impact. This was no mere military defeat. It marked a fundamental turning point in civilization, a watershed event that would shape the ethnic, cultural, and political landscape of Europe for centuries to come. The decisive aftermath of the battle was the definitive establishment of the northern boundary of the Roman Empire along the Rhine and Danube rivers. The decision, made by Emperor Augustus in a state of shock and confirmed by the pragmatic Tiberius, proved to be final. Over the next 4 centuries, Rome invested enormous resources in constructing and maintaining this frontier, known as the Limes. Hundreds of forts and watchtowers rose along the borders, and a network of military roads was systematically developed. The Rhine River, once just a natural waterway, transformed into a formidable barrier, separating 2 worlds. On its western bank lay the Romanized civilization, which would evolve into Romance languages like French, Spanish, and Italian, while behind it stretched the lands of free Germanic tribes, who continued to speak their own dialects. This border, carved out through the bloodshed of legionaries in the Varus battles, largely predetermined the future boundaries of France and Germany. The defeat in the Teutoburg Forest thus fundamentally altered Roman strategy. the empire shifted from an era of endless expansion to one of defense and consolidation of those territories already subdued. The dream of an empire without borders died in the murky swamps of Germania. Rome recognized that there were limits to its power, that certain peoples could not be wholly subdued or assimilated by force. This realization had a profound effect on the Roman mindset, fostering a new awareness of the boundaries of imperial influence. For the Germanic tribes, the victory over Armenia held immense significance. It allowed them to preserve their independence, uphold their traditional culture, language, and social structures. The outcome of this struggle, therefore, was not merely a military victory, but a vital step in maintaining their collective identity and autonomy against the expanding Roman realm. Although these tribes and peoples never succeeded in uniting into a single, cohesive nation-state, they continued their development independently, outside the direct control of Roman authority. Over the centuries, groups such as the Franks, Goths, Vandals, and Saxons by the 4th century had grown strong and learned much from their powerful neighbour, the Roman Empire. It was these very tribes, having gained strength and insight, who, 4 centuries later, crossed the mighty Rhine River. On the ruins left by the Western Roman Empire, they established their own kingdoms, new barbarian realms that would eventually serve as the foundations for medieval Europe and, ultimately, modern Europe as we know it today. Among these tribes, the figure of Arminius rose to become a potent symbol whose significance evolved markedly over the centuries. Forgotten and overlooked for long periods, he was rediscovered during the Reformation era. The reformer Martin Luther saw in Arminius the first Germanic hero, a symbol of resistance against foreign dominance, specifically the papal authority of Rome. During the 10th century, a period marked by the unification of Germany, Arminius, also called Hermann, became celebrated as the nation's foremost hero, who mythically inherited the role of the founding father of the German people. His legacy was so influential that in 1875, an enormous monument 53 meters tall was erected in the Teutoburg Forest, known as the Germania Monument. This towering structure depicts Arminius in a martial stance, wielding a sword raised high and directed westward, symbolically pointing toward France, which at the time was seen as Germany's main adversary. The ancient chieftain from Hesse was thus posthumously invoked in the service of modern nationalism. Today, when we analyse this historic encounter from the perspective of 2,000 years of history, it resonates far beyond a mere clash between armies. It embodies the collision of two worlds, two civilizations, two visions of order, sovereignty, and freedom. On one side was the universalist, urban, and juridical empire of Rome, built on law, governance, and territorial control. On the other side stood a tribal, forest-based, fiercely independent world of the Germanic peoples, autonomous, rooted in nature, and driven by a deep desire for freedom. In the shadowy depths of the Teutoburg Forest, history made its decisive choice. Europe would not be a uniform, homogeneous entity. Instead, it would be a land marked by diversity and division. The price of this pivotal decision was steep and tragic. Around 20,000 lives were lost in the process, an immense toll. The conflict also resulted in the loss of two of Rome's revered eagles, symbols of imperial power, and left behind the unceasing cry of an aging emperor, echoing through the centuries as a haunting reminder of the costs of division and rebellion. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of the most significant and dramatic battles in human history. If your journey into the depths of the past has sparked your interest, we invite you to continue following these stories, delving into events and turning points that shaped our world. Your attention and engagement are the greatest rewards for this detailed exploration of history's profound moments.